Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are unpacking something absolutely massive. I mean, one of the most world-altering geopolitical shifts of the entire 20th century, the total collapse of the Soviet Union. We are talking about the end of a literal global superpower, the conclusion of the Cold War, and the sudden, explosive birth of over a dozen new nations across Europe and Asia. The sheer scale of this event is just staggering.
Okay, let's dive into this because there's a real mystery here, right? How does an empire of this magnitude just vanish almost overnight? And even more baffling, how is it that generations born in the very countries shaped by this collapse are taught so little about it in school today? It's wild. Even the people who watched it unfold live on television often struggle to explain exactly how all those dominoes fell. So today, we're going to trace the entire dissolution of the Soviet Union, from those foundational cracks all the way to the final fatal days.
Part 1. The Soviet Illusion. To understand how the Soviet Union collapsed, we first have to understand what it was actually built on. Because it didn't start out as this grim dystopian concept. In its simplest, earliest form, it represented a really lofty dream. So you have this original Marxist dream from the 1917 revolution, wiping out the class system, collective wealth, and just an unprecedented level of peace, freedom, and prosperity. It sounds like a utopia. But then you look at the Soviet reality. Measured against its own ideals, the system was an utter failure. Under leaders like Lenin and Stalin, it mutated into this incredibly bloated bureaucracy and a ruthless police state. We're talking about a regime that murdered 10 million of its own citizens and built an entire empire on forced labor camps and constant suffocating fear.
Which brings us to part 2, stagnation and Gorbachev. Fast forward to the 1970s and 80s, and the cracks in the Soviet command economy were glaringly obvious. This was a system planned entirely from Moscow, and it was catastrophically inefficient. It was essentially rewarding failure.
And this brilliantly illustrates the mood at the time. As the Soviet foreign minister bluntly put it in 1984, everything is rotten. It has to be changed. Even the highest levels of the younger Soviet leadership knew they were totally stagnant. So, in 1985, a new leader stepped up, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was actually the first leader born inside the Soviet Union, and he realized pretty quickly that if they didn't drastically change course, the whole empire was going to collapse right under its own weight. Gorbachev was a pragmatist at heart. His first major move, purely diplomatic. He knew he needed to fix the economy. And to do that, he desperately needed the outside world. So, step 1, open up to foreign investment. Step 2, start exporting Soviet goods globally. And step 3, which is absolutely crucial, thaw relations with the United States to end that incredibly expensive Cold War arms race. He actually started bringing troops home from Afghanistan and scaling back the military presence in Eastern Europe. He basically wanted to spend resources on his citizens, not on weapons. Part 3. Restructuring and openness. Now, here is where history takes a super fascinating turn, because Gorbachev genuinely believed in the communist ideal. He wasn't trying to destroy the system, he wanted to fix it from the inside out, using two massive, and as we'll see, ultimately fatal policies. The first was perestroika, which literally means restructuring. Spanning from 1985 to 1991, this was a massive attempt to shift from a rigid command economy to a mixed economy. Suddenly, businesses could be partially privately owned, they could set their own production targets based on demand, and they could actually keep their profits. The state completely stopped subsidizing failing businesses, but the transition was a total disaster. Why? Well, amazingly, the Central Planning Commission didn't even have a basic model of how their own economy actually functioned. So when those state subsidies vanished, businesses scrambled. This resulted in massive product shortages and those infamous endlessly long queues just to buy basic food items. So the crucial point here is the tragic irony of it all. The old system collapsed before the new one had time to begin working. The government's tax revenue completely plummeted right when they needed to spend way more on things like pensions. They were suddenly running a huge budget deficit. Even Gorbachev himself later admitted this was a tragic mistake. They dismantled the only economic engine they had, as broken as it was, before the new capitalist-style engine was even fully built. Compounding all this economic chaos was Gorbachev's second major policy, Glasnost, meaning openness or transparency. This meant lifting travel restrictions, unbanning books and media, rolling back the secret police, and actually allowing freedom of speech and the press. Gorbachev really hoped this intellectual renaissance would help citizens point out flaws and ultimately improve the communist system. But instead, citizens, who were now acutely aware of their plummeting living standards and the absolute lies of state propaganda, used their newfound freedom to realize something entirely different. They didn't want to fix communism. They wanted out completely. Part 4. The dominoes fall. As is so often the case with crumbling empires, the whole unraveling began at the fringes. The Warsaw Pact satellite states, emboldened by Gorbachev's reforms and definitely sensing weakness in Moscow, began to really stir.
Talk about an incredible domino effect. It's actually mind-boggling when you realize how rapidly this escalated across Eastern Europe in just 1989. In Poland, trade union protests led to the first non-communist government since World War II. In Hungary, mass demonstrations pushed the government to literally dismantle the Iron Curtain, opening its borders with capitalist Austria. Well, this caused a massive crisis for East Germany because its citizens used Hungary as a loophole escape route. When East Germany tried to clamp down, massive protests erupted. And then you get those vivid anecdotes of confused border guards receiving absolutely no orders from above, just opening the gates. Citizens literally chiseled the Berlin Wall to pieces. Finally, in Romania, what started as a protest over an arrested minister turned into a full-scale violent revolution, ending with a stunned dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, being overthrown by his own military and people. Let's move along and see how this builds, because when you map this out, the breakneck speed is just stunning. August, Poland flips. November, the Berlin Wall falls, and Czechoslovakia's leadership resigns in just 11 days during the Velvet Revolution. December, Romania's regime falls. Literally, by the beginning of 1990, every single Warsaw Pact nation had experienced a political revolution. And you know what the most shocking part of all of this was? Unlike in the past, like 1956 or 1968 when Soviet tanks brutally crushed dissent, this time, the Soviet troops stationed in these countries did absolutely nothing. Part 5, the final collapse. Okay, so the outer empire was gone. But what about the core? What about the Soviet Union itself? Well, with satellite states breaking free without any military reprisal whatsoever, the internal republics that actually made up the USSR realized Moscow was no longer willing to use force to keep them in line. Now, what's really interesting here is the number 75%. Because as local independence movements were gaining massive traction, Gorbachev desperately tried to save the nation by proposing a decentralized equal federation. In March 1991, they actually held a nationwide referendum on this, and over 75% of the nearly 150 million people who voted said yes. They actually wanted to preserve the Soviet Union as a renewed democratic federation of equal states. It really looked like a peaceful transition was possible, but communist hardliners in the military and the secret police absolutely despised this plan. So in August 1991, they launched a coup. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest, crushed the free press, and quite literally rolled tanks right into Moscow. But they completely miscalculated the people. Citizens formed actual human barricades to stop the military. Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected president of the Russian Republic, famously climbed atop a tank to condemn the coup. The whole thing collapsed in just 2 days. But the intense irony here? These hardliners who were trying to save the Soviet Union completely destroyed the last shred of trust anyone had in Moscow. The Federation plan was totally dead. After that August coup, the final dominoes fell at absolute lightning speed. Within days, Estonia, Latvia, Ukraine, Belarus, and others declared full independence. By December, even Russia itself had declared independence from the very union it had built. With literally nothing left to govern, on December 26, 1991, the 69-year-old empire was officially declared dead. There were no grand parades, just a quiet, unceremonious resignation. Gorbachev stepped down with a really short, poignant speech. He stated, "Society was suffocating in the vice of the command bureaucratic system, doomed to serve ideology and bear the terrible burden of the arms race." He openly acknowledged that the rigid ideology had crushed its own people. And as our source material notes, Gorbachev possessed a truly rare quality for a world leader. He knew exactly when to quit. He had overseen the lifting of a totalitarian dictatorship without plunging the core of the empire into a bloody civil war. And that brings us to the conclusion of this explainer. The Soviet Union fell because its lofty ideals couldn't mask the brutal reality of its execution, and its attempts to modernize only exposed its rotting foundation. But I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder today. How could a regime so thoroughly and triumphantly dismantled see the yoke of totalitarian dictatorship return to many of those very same regions just a few decades later? History, it seems, rarely moves in a straight line. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking questions.